The Three Kings' Ransom. Welcome, dear listeners, to Velvet Clues. I'm Connor, your narrator for this evening's tale of mystery and deception. Before we begin, I'd like to ask you something. Do you remember your first Epiphany parade? Perhaps it was the glittering crowns, the exotic costumes, or the solemn procession that captured your imagination as a child. Share your memories in the comments below. I always enjoy reading about the traditions that shape our lives. Now, settle in with your evening tea and let us begin our journey into a most unusual Epiphany celebration. Chapter 1. A procession through St. Mary Mead. Miss Jane Marple stood at her cottage window, observing the preparations for St. Mary Mead's annual Epiphany parade with the keen interest of someone who understood that even the most innocent traditions could harbour darker currents. The January afternoon was crisp and bright, with frost still clinging to the edges of her garden path despite the winter sun's best efforts. The parade committee had outdone themselves this year, she noted with approval. 3 magnificent costumes had been commissioned from a theatrical supplier in London, complete with jewelled crowns and flowing robes that caught the light in a most satisfactory manner. The 3 kings would process through the village, distributing sweets to children and collecting donations for the Church Restoration Fund. Such a lovely tradition, murmured Mrs. Bantry, who had joined Miss Marple for tea and parade watching. Though, I must say, I was surprised when Harold Pemberton agreed to play Melchior. He's usually so reserved about public appearances. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles thoughtfully. Harold Pemberton, the village funeral director, was indeed an unexpected choice for the lead king. A man of impeccable professional reputation, he had managed Pemberton and Sons funeral services for nearly 30 years, handling the final arrangements for most of St. Mary Mead's departed with dignity and discretion. Perhaps he wishes to show a different side of himself to the community, Miss Marple suggested gently. Funeral directors often struggle with their sombre professional image. This might be his way of engaging with the living, rather than always attending to the dead. Through the window they could see the 3 chosen kings assembling near the church. Pemberton, resplendent in purple robes as Melchior, carried an ornate golden casket. Beside him stood George Hartley, the bank manager, dressed as Caspar in green silk, bearing a silver vessel of frankincense. The 3rd king, Balthazar, was played by young Timothy Morrison, the new veterinarian, whose enthusiasm for village life had endeared him to many. "The gifts look remarkably authentic this year," Mrs. Bantry observed. "Are those real gold leaf decorations on the caskets?" "Brass, I believe," Miss Marple replied, though something about the containers caught her attention. They seemed heavier than mere props, should be, and Pemberton appeared to be handling his with particular care. The parade began with the church bells ringing out across the village. Children lined the streets, their faces bright with excitement, as the procession moved slowly down the high street. The 3 kings walked with measured dignity, occasionally pausing to offer blessings and distribute coins of chocolate wrapped in gold foil. Miss Marple noticed several interesting details as the parade passed her cottage. Pemberton seemed unusually pale beneath his theatrical makeup, and his hands trembled slightly as he raised the golden casket in blessing. She also observed Alfred Jennings, the elderly widower from Gossington Hall, watching the procession with an expression of intense concentration rather than the benign enjoyment one might expect. "Mr. Jennings seems particularly interested in the proceedings," she remarked to Mrs. Bantry. "Poor man," her friend replied. "He's been so withdrawn since Martha passed last month. Harold Pemberton handled the funeral arrangements, of course. Did a beautiful job, though I heard there was some confusion about Martha's jewellery. Something about her wedding ring, I believe." Miss Marple filed this information away with the careful attention she applied to all village gossip. In her experience, confusion about funeral arrangements often led to more serious complications. The parade continued its stately progress toward the village green, where a small stage had been erected for the final ceremony. The 3 kings would present their gifts symbolically at a nativity scene, after which the contents would be auctioned for charity. It was a tradition that dated back decades, combining religious observance with practical fundraising in a way that satisfied both the devout and the merely charitable. As the procession reached the green, Miss Marple noticed that Pemberton's pallor had increased markedly. The funeral director paused, swaying slightly, and she saw him grip his golden casket more tightly, as though drawing strength from its presence. Chapter 2. Gold that glitters too bright. The ceremony on the village green proceeded with the rehearsed precision that came from years of tradition. The small platform had been decorated with evergreen boughs and white ribbons, creating a festive backdrop for the Three Kings presentation. Miss Marple had secured an excellent vantage point near the platform's edge, her keen eyes missing nothing of the unfolding drama. Harold Pemberton ascended the platform first, his purple robes catching in the light breeze that whispered across the green. The golden casket in his hands seemed to grow heavier with each step, and Miss Marple noticed beads of perspiration forming on his brow despite the January cold. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced Reverend Clement, who stood beside the nativity scene, "we gather today to commemorate the journey of the Magi, who brought gifts to honour the Christ child. Our Three Kings will now present their offerings, which will then be auctioned for the restoration of St. Mary's bell tower." George Hartley and Timothy Morrison took their positions flanking Pemberton, their own gifts held reverently before them. The frankincense vessel gleamed silver in Hartley's steady hands, while Morrison's myrrh container, fashioned from what appeared to be carved jade, caught the afternoon light beautifully. "I bring gold," Pemberton intoned, his voice surprisingly weak for such a physically imposing man. "A gift fit for a king." He raised the casket high, and for a moment the brass fittings caught the sun in a way that made them appear almost supernaturally bright. It was then that disaster struck. Pemberton's face contorted suddenly, his breath coming in sharp gasps. The golden casket slipped from his trembling fingers, crashing to the platform with a sound that echoed across the suddenly silent green. The lid flew open, scattering its contents across the wooden boards. But instead of chocolates or symbolic tokens, what spilled forth appeared to be actual gold coins, along with a fine powder that caught the wind and dispersed in glittering clouds. Pemberton clutched at his throat, his eyes wide with terror, before collapsing heavily to his knees. "Doctor! We need a doctor!" Reverend Clement's voice cut through the shocked silence. Dr. Haydock, who had been watching from the crowd, rushed forward immediately, his medical bag fortunately at hand in his nearby car. Miss Marple observed the scene with professional detachment, even as chaos erupted around her. She noticed several critical details that others in their panic might overlook. The scattered coins bore unusual markings, and the powder that had dispersed from the casket left a faint yellowish residue on the platform boards. Most significantly, she observed Alfred Jennings pushing through the crowd, his face bearing an expression not of shock but of grim satisfaction. Dr. Haydock knelt beside the fallen man, his experienced hands checking for vital signs. "He's still breathing, but barely. We need an ambulance immediately. Everyone please stay back." While the doctor worked, Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the other two kings. George Hartley had set down his frankincense vessel with extreme care, backing away from it as though it might explode. Timothy Morrison, younger and less experienced with crisis, stood frozen in place, still clutching his myrrh container. "Nobody touch anything," Inspector Slack's authoritative voice rang out. The inspector had been attending the parade in an unofficial capacity, but his police instincts had immediately engaged. This is now a potential crime scene. Miss Marple appreciated the inspector's quick thinking. She had already formed her own suspicions about the nature of Pemberton's collapse. The yellow residue, the distinctive bitter almond scent that she could detect even from several feet away, and the man's symptoms all pointed to a horrifying conclusion. "Arsenic," she murmured quietly to Mrs. Bantry, who had appeared at her elbow, "or something very similar, mixed with the gold dust in the casket." Mrs. Bantry gasped. But who would do such a thing, and why during the parade? Before Miss Marple could respond, a commotion near the platform drew their attention. Alfred Jennings had broken through the police cordon and was standing over the scattered gold coins, his face twisted with rage. "Brass!" he shouted, holding up one of the coins. "These are brass, not gold. Just like the ring you buried with my Martha, Pemberton. You thought I wouldn't notice, didn't you? You thought I wouldn't check." The implications of this accusation rippled through the crowd like a stone thrown into still water. Harold Pemberton, respected funeral director, was being accused of the most heinous violation of trust imaginable, stealing from the dead. Inspector Slack moved quickly to restrain Jennings, but the damage was done. The seed of suspicion had been planted, and Miss Marple could see in the faces around her the dawning realization that their trusted funeral director might have harboured dark secrets. The ambulance arrived with merciful speed, and Pemberton was loaded aboard, Dr. Haydock accompanying him. As the vehicle departed, its siren wailing mournfully across the village, Miss Marple noticed something that others had missed. Timothy Morrison had quietly set down his myrrh container and was edging away from the scene, his face pale with more than just shock. Chapter 3. Frankincense and Dark Suspicions. The village hall had been transformed into a makeshift investigation centre within hours of Harold Pemberton's collapse. Inspector Slack had commandeered the main room, setting up tables for evidence and establishing a clear chain of custody for the 3 ceremonial gifts. Miss Marple, as a witness to the events, had been asked to provide a statement, though she suspected her reputation for observational acuity had more to do with the inspector's tolerance of her presence. The golden casket sat sealed in an evidence bag on the central table, its brass fittings tarnished now with fingerprint powder. Beside it, equally secured, were the frankincense and myrrh containers, both awaiting testing by the police laboratory in London. The preliminary field test confirms arsenic, Inspector Slack announced to the small gathering of witnesses and suspects. A significant quantity mixed with gold dust and brass filings. Mr. Pemberton is in critical condition at the hospital. He may not survive the night. Alfred Jennings sat in a corner chair, his earlier rage replaced by a hollow exhaustion. His accusation about his wife's wedding ring had opened a Pandora's box of suspicion that now threatened to consume the entire village's trust in one of its most established institutions. "Mr. Jennings," the inspector continued, his tone professionally neutral, "I need you to explain exactly what you meant. About your wife's ring." The elderly widower straightened in his chair, his jaw set with determination. "Martha always wore her wedding ring, Inspector. 53 years we were married, and she never took it off. When she passed, I specifically asked Pemberton to leave it on her finger for the burial. He assured me it would be done." He paused, pulling out a handkerchief to dab at his eyes. "Last week, I was sorting through her jewellery box, the pieces she'd left to our granddaughter. I found our wedding photograph from 1970, and I noticed something. The ring in the photo had a distinctive engraving pattern, a Celtic knot design. But when I'd viewed Martha in her casket, the ring looked different, plainer." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly. "You exhumed the body?" "I had to know," Jennings replied firmly. "I petitioned the court, paid for everything myself. When they opened the casket, the ring on Martha's finger was brass, a cheap replica. The real gold ring, worth over £3,000 beyond its sentimental value, was gone." George Hartley, still in his Casper costume, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Surely this is a misunderstanding. Harold Pemberton has been serving this community for decades. His father before him." "That's precisely the problem," Inspector Slack observed. "A position of such trust, maintained over such a long period, would provide ample opportunity for systematic theft. We're now investigating whether other families might have been similarly victimized." Miss Marple had been quietly observing Timothy Morrison throughout this exchange. The young veterinarian had removed his Balthazar crown and was turning it nervously in his hands, his knuckles white with tension. "Dr. Morrison," she said gently, "you seem particularly distressed by these revelations." The young man started at being addressed. "It's just so shocking. I mean, I've only been in the village 6 months, but Mr. Pemberton seemed so respectable. He handled my aunt's funeral last year before I moved here. She was buried with her mother's Victorian cameo brooch." His voice trailed off, and Miss Marple noticed the way his eyes darted toward the door, as though contemplating escape. "We'll need to check all recent burials," Inspector Slack declared. "Every funeral Pemberton has handled in the past year at minimum. If this has been going on, we need to know the full extent." Mrs. Bantry, who had been permitted to remain as Miss Marple's companion, spoke up. "Inspector, who prepared the ceremonial gifts for today's parade? Surely whoever poisoned the gold would have had to have access beforehand." "An excellent question," the inspector replied. According to the parade committee, the gifts were prepared by Pemberton himself, with assistance from the other participants. They were stored in the church vestry overnight. Who had access to the vestry? Miss Marple inquired. The reverend, the church wardens, the cleaning staff, and anyone with a key to the church, which, in a village like this, could be half the population. Miss Marple noticed that Timothy Morrison had gone even paler at this information. She filed this observation away, along with the curious fact that he had been one of the last people to handle the gifts before the parade began. There's something else, Inspector Slack continued, producing an evidence bag containing what appeared to be a small glass vial. This was found in the vestry dustbin, recently discarded, with traces of arsenic residue. The vial was unmarked, but Miss Marple recognised its type immediately. It was the sort commonly used in veterinary practice for storing concentrated medications or pesticides. Her eyes moved naturally to Timothy Morrison, whose profession would give him ready access to such containers. "I think," she said carefully, "we need to consider not just who had means and opportunity, but who had discovered Pemberton's alleged thefts and might have decided to take justice into their own hands." The room fell silent as the implications of her words sank in. They were no longer simply investigating an attempted murder, but potentially a case of vigilante justice gone wrong, or perhaps very right, depending on one's perspective on Harold Pemberton's crimes. Chapter 4. Myrrh and Bitter Memories. The investigation had moved to Pemberton and Sons funeral services, a Victorian establishment that had served St. Mary Mead for over a century. The building stood like a sombre sentinel on Church Lane, its black-painted exterior and discreet brass plaque, speaking of generations of dignified service to the bereaved. Now, however, it was wrapped in police tape, its reputation as tattered as the yellow barriers that fluttered in the evening breeze. Miss Marple accompanied Inspector Slack through the premises, her sharp eyes taking in details that spoke volumes about Harold Pemberton's business practices. The front parlour, where families gathered to make arrangements, was impeccably maintained, with fresh flowers and polished furniture, creating an atmosphere of respectful comfort. But it was the preparation room in the basement that told a different story. Here, among the embalming equipment and cosmetic supplies, Sergeant Lake had discovered a concealed drawer containing an extraordinary collection of jewellery, carefully catalogued in a leather-bound ledger. "Look at this," the sergeant said, holding up the ledger for inspection. Every piece documented, with dates, descriptions, and what appears to be estimated values. Mrs. Martha Jennings, gold wedding band with Celtic design, replaced with brass replica, value £400. Inspector Slack's expression grew grimmer with each entry he read. There are dozens of entries here going back 3 years. Rings, brooches, watches, even gold teeth. He was running a systematic operation. Miss Marple examined the ledger with careful attention. "Notice the progression, Inspector. The early entries show smaller items, perhaps testing to see if anyone would notice. As his confidence grew, so did the value of his thefts. But why?" Mrs. Bantry, who had insisted on accompanying them, seemed genuinely bewildered. Harold Pemberton wasn't poor. This business has been successful for generations. "Gambling debts," came a voice from the doorway. Timothy Morrison stood there, his veterinary bag in hand. "I'm sorry to interrupt, Inspector, but I heard you were investigating here, and I felt I should come forward with information." Inspector Slack regarded the young veterinarian with suspicion. "What sort of information, Dr. Morrison?" "I've been treating Pemberton's dog for the past few months. During our conversations, he mentioned his struggles with online gambling. He tried to pass it off as casual entertainment, but I could see the signs. The stress, the constant checking of his phone for sports results, the mysterious payments that were always urgently needed." Miss Marple studied Morrison carefully. The young man seemed genuinely distressed, but there was something else in his manner, a nervous energy that suggested he wasn't telling the complete truth. "When did you last treat his dog?" she asked gently. "Yesterday morning, actually. A routine checkup. That's when I noticed something odd in his supplies cabinet. A bottle of arsenic-based rat poison, the old-fashioned kind that's been banned for years. I thought it strange, but didn't mention it." "You didn't think to report illegal pesticide possession?" Inspector Slack's tone was sharp. Morrison flushed. I thought perhaps it was an old bottle, forgotten. But then today, when Pemberton collapsed, and I smelled that bitter almond scent, I knew. Miss Marple noticed something the others might have missed. The way Morrison's hands trembled slightly as he set down his veterinary bag, the careful distance he maintained from the evidence table where the ceremonial gifts were displayed. "Dr. Morrison," she said thoughtfully, "your aunt who passed last year, what was her name?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. "Margaret Morrison. She lived in Little Wickham. Why do you ask?" Miss Marple consulted the ledger that Sergeant Lake still held. "Here it is. Margaret Morrison, Victorian cameo brooch, replaced with modern reproduction, value £600. The colour drained from Timothy Morrison's face. "That brooch was my grandmother's. It was supposed to stay in the family." "Is that why you moved to St. Mary Mead?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Not for the veterinary practice, but to investigate what happened to your aunt's jewellery?" Morrison sank into a nearby chair, his composure finally cracking. "I suspected something when I saw the brooch in the casket. It looked wrong, too new, too perfect. But I had no proof, and who would believe such an accusation against a respected funeral director?" "So you decided to take matters into your own hands?" Inspector Slack's voice was dangerously quiet. "No," Morrison protested. "I mean, yes, I came here to investigate, but I would never... I'm a veterinarian. I save lives. I don't take them." Miss Marple observed the interplay of emotions on the young man's face: fear, anger, grief, and something else. Guilt, perhaps, but of what nature? "Inspector," she said, "I believe we should test not just the gold, but also the frankincense and myrrh. If someone intended to poison Harold Pemberton specifically, they would need to ensure he chose the contaminated gift." "But the king's roles were assigned weeks ago," Mrs. Bantry pointed out. "Everyone knew Pemberton would carry the gold." "Precisely," Miss Marple replied. "Which raises the question, was this attempted murder? Or was it something else entirely? A warning, perhaps? Or a form of poetic justice?" The room fell silent as they contemplated this possibility. Through the window, the lights of St. Mary Mead twinkled innocently, but Miss Marple knew that beneath the village's peaceful exterior, dark currents of revenge and retribution were flowing. The sharp ring of Inspector Slack's telephone interrupted their contemplation. He listened intently, his expression growing increasingly grave. "That was the hospital," he announced. "Harold Pemberton has regained consciousness. He's asking for a priest and says he wants to make a full confession." Chapter 5. The Funeral Director's Confession. The hospital room was thick with the antiseptic smell that seemed to permeate every corner of the building, but beneath it, Miss Marple detected the unmistakable scent of fear. Harold Pemberton lay propped against several pillows, his face grey and drawn, tubes and wires connecting him to various machines that beeped and hummed with mechanical efficiency. Reverend Clement sat beside the bed, his prayer book closed on his lap, having already administered the last rites. Inspector Slack stood at the foot of the bed, notebook in hand, while Miss Marple positioned herself discreetly by the window, where she could observe everyone's reactions. "I need to tell the truth," Pemberton whispered, his voice raw from the tubes that had been down his throat. "All of it, before it's too late." "Take your time, Mr. Pemberton," Inspector Slack said, though his tone suggested urgency. "Start from the beginning." Pemberton's eyes closed briefly, as though gathering strength. "It started 3 years ago. The business was failing. People were choosing cremation over burial, using funeral chains instead of family firms. Then there were the gambling debts. I thought I could win back what I'd lost, but it only got worse." He paused to sip water through a straw, his hands shaking. "The first time was an accident, really. Mrs. Whitmore's ruby ring got caught when we were preparing her. The stone fell out. I meant to repair it, but then I realised no one would know if I replaced it with a synthetic stone. Sold the real ruby for £2,000, covered 3 months of loan payments." "And it escalated from there," Miss Marple observed quietly. Pemberton nodded miserably. "Each time, I told myself it would be the last. But the debts kept growing, and the dead, well, they didn't need their treasures anymore, did they? I kept careful records, always meaning to pay it back somehow when the business recovered. The ledger we found," Inspector Slack interjected, You documented everything. I'm a methodical man, Inspector. Even in my crimes, I maintained proper records. Perhaps I always knew this day would come. Alfred Jennings had been permitted to attend, at Pemberton's request. The widower stood rigid by the door, his face a mask of controlled fury. "My Martha's ring," Jennings said, his voice tight with emotion. "You looked me in the eye and promised it would be buried with her." "I'm sorry," Pemberton whispered. "I'm so very sorry. The ring was particularly valuable, and I was desperate. My creditors were threatening violence." Miss Marple had been watching Timothy Morrison, who stood in the corner, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Pemberton, who knew about your thefts?" "No one," I thought. I was so careful. But then, about a month ago, I received a note, anonymous. It said, "I know what you've done. Justice will come at Epiphany." I thought it was a prank at first, but then more notes came, each more specific. "Do you still have these notes?" Inspector Slack asked urgently. "In my office safe. The combination is my mother's birthday, 140723. "Who else knew you would be playing Melchior?" Miss Marple inquired. "The entire village. It was announced in the parish newsletter weeks ago. But the gifts, I prepared them myself, with help from George and Timothy. I filled the gold casket with chocolate coins and gold-wrapped sweets, nothing more." "Someone replaced the contents," Inspector Slack stated. "Added the arsenic-laced powder and the brass coins. Mr. Jennings, where were you last night?" The widower straightened. "At home, Inspector, alone, planning to attend the parade to confront Pemberton publicly. I wanted the whole village to know what he'd done, but I didn't try to kill him. That would have been too merciful." Miss Marple had noticed something significant. "Dr. Morrison, you mentioned treating Mr. Pemberton's dog yesterday morning. Did you happen to notice anything unusual about the parade preparations?" Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "The gifts were on his desk. The gold casket was open. I commented on how realistic the coins looked." "Were you alone with them at any point?" Inspector Slack pressed. "Briefly. Pemberton went to get his checkbook from another room. But I didn't. I would never." "Mr. Pemberton," Miss Marple said gently, "think carefully. The person who did this knew about your thefts and chose a very specific method of revenge. Arsenic poisoning, often called inheritance powder in Victorian times. Someone with knowledge of both history and chemistry." Pemberton's eyes widened suddenly. "There was someone else. A woman came to see me 2 weeks ago. Said she was researching Victorian funeral practices for a book. Asked specifically about jewellery and burial customs. She seemed particularly interested in how items were secured in caskets." "Can you describe her?" Inspector Slack asked urgently. "Middle-aged, grey hair in a bun," spoke with a slight accent. "Welsh, perhaps. She signed the visitor book as M. Sir Hughes." Miss Marple and Inspector Slack exchanged glances. There was no M. Hughes in the village, and no one matching that description had been seen recently. "A disguise, perhaps?" Miss Marple mused. "Someone who needed to confirm their suspicions about your activities before taking action." The room fell silent except for the steady beeping of the medical equipment. Harold Pemberton had confessed his crimes, but the identity of his would-be executioner remained a mystery, and somewhere in St. Mary Mead, someone who had taken justice into their own hands was still free. "There's something else," Pemberton whispered, his strength clearly fading. "The woman, she wore a distinctive brooch, a Victorian cameo. I remember thinking it looked familiar." All eyes turned to Timothy Morrison, whose aunt's Victorian cameo had been among the items stolen. The young veterinarian's face had gone completely white. Chapter 6. Traces of old poison. The police laboratory in London had worked through the night, and by morning Inspector Slack had received a comprehensive report that shed new light on the attempted murder. Miss Marple sat in the inspector's temporary office at the village hall, studying the findings with the careful attention she applied to all documentary evidence. The arsenic was mixed with gold powder and brass filings, Inspector Slack read from the report. But here's the interesting part. It wasn't modern arsenic. The chemical composition suggests it's at least 50 years old, possibly from agricultural supplies that have been banned for decades. Miss Marple looked up sharply. "That's most significant, Inspector. Modern arsenic would be traceable through recent purchases, but old stock suggests someone with access to long-stored supplies. Or someone who knew where to find them, the inspector added grimly. We've been searching the Pemberton funeral home more thoroughly. Sergeant Lake discovered something interesting in the old carriage house. They made their way to the funeral home, where Sergeant Lake was waiting in what had once been the stable for horse-drawn hearses. The space had been converted to storage decades ago, filled with dusty boxes and forgotten equipment from earlier eras of the funeral trade. Here, Inspector, the sergeant said, indicating a wooden crate marked with faded warnings about poisonous contents. Victorian-era embalming supplies. Arsenic was commonly used as a preservative. There's enough here to kill half the village. Miss Marple examined the crate carefully. Notice the dust patterns, Inspector. This crate has been disturbed recently. Someone knew exactly where to find what they needed. But who would know about these old supplies? Mrs. Bantry asked, having joined them despite official protests. Someone familiar with the funeral home's history, Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, or someone who had researched it thoroughly. Timothy Morrison arrived, summoned by the inspector for further questioning. The young veterinarian looked haggard, as though he hadn't slept. Dr. Morrison, Inspector Slack began, we need to discuss your aunt's funeral in more detail. Who else attended? Who might have noticed the switched brooch? Morrison thought carefully. It was a small service. Myself, a few neighbours from Little Wickham, and my cousin Sarah. She's a chemist at the university. She particularly admired the brooch, said it looked just like the original. A chemist? Miss Marple's interest was clearly piqued. Where is your cousin now? Back in London, I assume. She teaches at Imperial College, but she couldn't be involved in this. She barely knew Pemberton existed. Inspector Slack made a note. We'll need to verify her whereabouts. Now, about this mysterious M. Hughes, who visited Pemberton. Did you see anyone matching that description around the village? No, but, Morrison hesitated. I did see someone unusual at the church yesterday morning. A woman in old-fashioned clothing wearing a heavy veil. I thought she was an early mourner for someone's funeral. Miss Marple leaned forward. Can you describe her build, her gait? Average height, walked with a slight limp. Carried an old-fashioned carpet bag. A limp, Miss Marple mused. Real or affected, I wonder? The investigation moved to the church, where Reverend Clement provided access to the vestry where the parade gifts had been stored. The small room still showed signs of police examination, with fingerprint powder dusting various surfaces. The gifts were brought here 2 days before the parade, the Reverend explained. I locked them in myself. Only myself and the church wardens have keys. And the cleaning staff? Miss Marple inquired. Mrs. Patterson comes in twice weekly. She was here the morning before the parade. They found Mrs. Patterson at her cottage, nervously polishing silver that already gleamed. She was a widow in her 60s, known for her meticulous attention to detail and her discretion about village matters. I saw nothing unusual, she insisted, though I did find the vestry window unlocked that morning. I secured it, of course. Someone could have entered during the night, Inspector Slack observed. Miss Marple had been examining Mrs. Patterson's cottage with interest. On the mantelpiece sat a collection of photographs, including one of a younger Mrs. Patterson with what appeared to be her sister. Your family, Mrs. Patterson? She asked gently. Yes, that's my sister Margaret. She passed last year, lived in Little Wickham. Miss Marple and Inspector Slack exchanged meaningful glances. Margaret Morrison and Margaret Patterson, possibly the same person. Was Morrison her married name? Miss Marple asked carefully. Mrs. Patterson nodded. She kept it after her divorce. Her son Timothy is the new veterinarian. Such a clever boy, though I worry he took his mother's death very hard. The pieces were beginning to fall into place. Timothy Morrison's aunt and Mrs. Patterson's sister were the same person. The connection to the village was stronger than anyone had realized. Mrs. Patterson, Inspector Slack said formally, I need to ask you some difficult questions about your sister's funeral and your nephew's recent activities. The woman's composure finally cracked. I knew something was wrong when I saw the brooch in the casket. It was too new, too perfect. Margaret's original had a tiny chip from when she dropped it years ago. I told Timothy, but he said I was imagining things. But you weren't, Miss Marple said gently. No, and when Timothy moved here and confirmed that Pemberton had been stealing, I wanted to do something. But what? Who would believe the church cleaner? So, you took matters into your own hands? Inspector Slack suggested. No, Mrs. Patterson protested. I thought about it, certainly. I even looked up old methods of punishment for thieves, but I could never actually hurt anyone, not even someone as despicable as Harold Pemberton. Miss Marple studied the woman's face carefully. The distress seemed genuine, but there was something else there. A knowledge, perhaps, that she was protecting someone. Mrs. Patterson, she said quietly. Where is your nephew now? I don't know. He left early this morning. Said he had house calls to make. But he seemed strange, almost relieved about something. As they prepared to search for Timothy Morrison, Miss Marple reflected that the web of connections in this case was becoming increasingly complex. A stolen brooch, a sister's funeral, and a nephew with both motive and possible means. Yet something still didn't quite fit. Chapter 7. The Veterinarian's Secret. Timothy Morrison's veterinary clinic stood at the edge of the village, a converted cottage with modern additions that housed his surgery and treatment rooms. When Inspector Slack's team arrived, they found the front door unlocked but no sign of the young veterinarian. What they did discover sent shockwaves through the investigation. Miss Marple stood in Morrison's private office, examining the evidence that Sergeant Lake had uncovered. Spread across the desk were detailed notes about Harold Pemberton's activities, photographs of jewellery, and most damning, a collection of letters signed M. Hughes. He wrote them himself, Inspector Slack observed, comparing the handwriting to Morrison's appointment book. The mysterious woman who visited Pemberton was Morrison in disguise. But it was what they found in the locked cabinet that proved most revealing, a Victorian-era medical bag that had belonged to Morrison's grandmother, complete with antique glass vials and a leather-bound journal dating back to 1876. Miss Marple read from the journal with growing interest. Listen to this, Inspector. Today I prepared the special mixture for the Blackwood family. Arsenic and gold dust, the powder of inheritance, they call it. How many fortunes have changed hands with its assistance? Morrison's grandmother was involved in poisonings? Mrs. Bantry gasped. No, Miss Marple corrected gently. She was a midwife who documented the criminal cases she encountered. This journal is a record of murders she helped investigate. Young Timothy would have grown up hearing these stories. The sound of a car engine drew their attention to the window. Timothy Morrison had returned, but he wasn't alone. With him was a young woman with striking auburn hair and intelligent eyes that bore a family resemblance. That must be Sarah Morrison, the chemist cousin, Inspector Slack said. Sergeant, bring them both in. The cousins entered the office with remarkably different demeanours. Timothy appeared resigned, almost relieved, while Sarah radiated nervous energy, her eyes darting between the evidence on the desk and the police officers. I suppose you found everything, Timothy said quietly, sinking into a chair. I'm actually glad it's over. Dr. Morrison, Inspector Slack began formally, you admit to visiting Harold Pemberton disguised as M. Sir Hughes? Yes. I needed to confirm my suspicions about the thefts. My aunt's brooch was just the beginning. When I investigated further, I found he'd been stealing from dozens of families. Sarah Morrison stepped forward. Inspector, my cousin is trying to protect me. The disguise was my idea. I have theatrical experience from university, and I knew Timothy would be recognised. Miss Marple studied both cousins carefully. But neither of you poisoned Harold Pemberton, did you? The question hung in the air, and both Morrisons looked genuinely surprised. No, Timothy said emphatically. We gathered evidence, yes. We planned to go to the police after the parade when we'd have the whole village's attention. The poisoning ruined everything. Then who? Inspector Slack demanded. Miss Marple had moved to examine the veterinary supplies more closely. Dr. Morrison, you mentioned seeing rat poison in Pemberton's office. Did you report it? No, I thought it was just old stock. But you knew it was there. Who else did you tell? Timothy thought carefully. Just Aunt Patricia, Mrs. Patterson. She was upset about the thefts, and I wanted to assure her that justice would come. Mrs. Patterson, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. Who had access to the church vestry? Who knew about Victorian poisoning methods from her sister's stories? And who had the strongest emotional connection to the original theft? They returned to Mrs. Patterson's cottage to find it empty, but on the kitchen table lay a sealed envelope addressed to Inspector Slack. Inside was a full confession written in a shaky hand. I couldn't let him continue, the letter read. My sister Margaret saved for years to buy that cameo brooch. It was the only valuable thing she owned, and Pemberton stole it from her corpse. When Timothy confirmed my suspicions, I knew I had to act. I've lived in this village my entire life, cleaned the church for 30 years. I knew about the old poisons in Pemberton's carriage house from when my father worked there as a boy. I knew Pemberton would choose the gold. His greed would demand it. I didn't mean to kill him, just to make him as sick as he'd made all of us who trusted him. The brass coins were my touch of irony. Fake gold for a fake man. I've gone to where you won't find me. Don't blame Timothy. He knew nothing. Inspector Slack immediately issued alerts to all ports and stations, but Miss Marple suspected Mrs. Patterson had planned her escape as carefully as she'd planned the poisoning. She used the old arsenic to make it harder to trace, the inspector said. Wore the disguise Timothy had created to throw us off the scent. And chose Epiphany, Miss Marple added, the revelation of truth, for her act of justice. Timothy Morrison slumped in his chair. I should have seen it. Aunt Patricia was always so quiet, so accepting. I never imagined she'd take such drastic action. The quiet ones often surprise us, Miss Marple observed. Your aunt spent her life in service to others, cleaning up after them, keeping their secrets. Perhaps she felt it was time someone cleaned up Harold Pemberton's mess. As the police continued their search for Mrs. Patterson, Miss Marple reflected on the tragic chain of events. Greed had led to theft, theft to revenge, and revenge to attempted murder. The Three Kings' gifts had indeed carried a ransom, but not the kind anyone had expected. Chapter 8. Brass Coins and Golden Truths. The search for Mrs. Patterson had extended beyond St. Mary Mead to the surrounding counties, but it was Miss Marple who suggested they look closer to home. 3 days after the poisoning, she stood with Inspector Slack in the old section of the village cemetery, where generations of Pattersons lay beneath weathered headstones. She wouldn't have gone far, Miss Marple explained. This village is her entire world. Everything she loves is here. They found Mrs. Patterson sitting on a bench beside her sister Margaret's grave, wearing her best coat and hat as if dressed for church. She looked up at their approach with no surprise, only a deep weariness that seemed to age her beyond her years. "I've been waiting," she said simply. "I wanted to say goodbye to Margaret first." Inspector Slack stepped forward. "Patricia Patterson, I'm arresting you for the attempted murder of Harold Pemberton." She rose with dignity, smoothing her coat. "Attempted? Then he survived. I suppose that's for the best. Living with his shame might be worse than dying." As they walked back through the cemetery, Mrs. Patterson began to speak, her voice steady and clear. "You have to understand, Miss Marple, it wasn't just about Margaret's brooch. It was about trust. Every family who came to Pemberton was grieving, vulnerable. He looked them in the eye and promised to care for their loved ones, then robbed them blind." "But why poison?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Why not simply expose him?" "I tried leaving anonymous notes first, hoping to frighten him into confessing, but he ignored them. When Timothy told me about the rat poison in Pemberton's office, about our family's history with such things, it seemed like fate was showing me the way." They arrived at the police station, where Harold Pemberton was waiting, having been released from hospital that morning. He looked frailer, older, his former pompous bearing replaced by something broken. When he saw Mrs. Patterson, tears began to roll down his cheeks. "Patricia," he whispered, "I'm so sorry. For everything." Mrs. Patterson regarded him with a mixture of pity and disgust. "Your apologies won't bring back what you stole. Not just the jewellery, but the trust, the peace of mind. Do you know what it's like to wonder if your sister is resting peacefully or if even her grave has been violated?" The confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of Alfred Jennings, accompanied by his solicitor. "Inspector," the lawyer announced, "my client wishes to make a statement regarding the recovery of stolen property." Jennings stepped forward, his bearing military straight. "I've been conducting my own investigation since discovering the theft of Martha's ring. I've contacted 17 families who used Pemberton services in the past 3 years. 14 confirmed missing items. We're forming a committee to pursue legal action. Harold Pemberton slumped in his chair. I'll make full restitution. I've kept records of everything. The items that weren't sold are in a safety deposit box at the bank. I'll return them all. And the items you did sell, the solicitor pressed. I'll pay market value plus interest. It will bankrupt me, but it's only what I deserve. Miss Marple had been observing Timothy Morrison, who stood apart from the group, clearly struggling with conflicting emotions. His aunt had tried to kill a man partly on his behalf, using information he had provided. Dr. Morrison, she said kindly, you mustn't blame yourself. You sought justice through investigation, not violence. But I enabled her, he replied miserably. I told her about the poison, about Pemberton's crimes. I should have known she'd act on it. Your aunt is a grown woman who made her own choices, Inspector Slack interjected, though the court will certainly consider the provocations she faced. Sarah Morrison, who had remained silent until now, spoke up. There's something else you should know, Inspector. I've been researching Harold Pemberton's financial records. The gambling debts he mentioned, they're connected to an organised crime syndicate in London. They've been pressuring him for months. This revelation cast the entire case in a new light. Pemberton hadn't just been a greedy man, but a desperate one, caught between criminal creditors and his need to maintain his respectable facade. They threatened my family, Pemberton confirmed, said they'd burn down the funeral home with me in it if I didn't pay. The theft started as a temporary solution that became a permanent trap. Miss Marple sighed deeply. How often tragedy breeds tragedy. Your desperation led to theft, which led to Mrs. Patterson's desperation for justice, which led to attempted murder. A chain of casualties, all victims in their own way. The legal proceedings would be complex. All parties agreed. Mrs. Patterson would face charges for attempted murder, though her lawyer would argue for mitigation based on emotional distress and provocation. Harold Pemberton would be charged with systematic theft and fraud. The gambling syndicate would be investigated by Scotland Yard. What about the parade? Mrs. Bantry asked. The village is in uproar. Some want to cancel all future Epiphany celebrations. That would be a mistake, Miss Marple said firmly. Traditions shouldn't be abandoned because of one person's actions. The parade represents hope, gift-giving, and revelation. Perhaps this year it revealed more than anyone expected, but truth, however painful, is always preferable to deception. As the various parties were led away to face their respective consequences, Miss Marple noticed something that gave her hope. Timothy Morrison and Alfred Jennings were talking quietly, planning how to help the families recover their stolen treasures. From tragedy, perhaps some good might emerge. The brass coins from the poisoned gift had been collected as evidence, each one a symbol of Pemberton's deceptions. But the real gold, Miss Marple reflected, was the truth finally coming to light. Chapter 9. The Widow's Justice. The preliminary hearing at the magistrate's court drew most of St. Mary Mead's population, all eager to witness the unfolding of what the local newspaper had dubbed the Epiphany poisoning. Miss Marple sat in the public gallery beside Mrs. Bantry, observing the proceedings with her characteristic attention to human nature under stress. Mrs. Patterson stood in the dock, wearing the same black dress she wore for church, her hands folded calmly before her. Her solicitor, a young woman from London named Jennifer Clark, had built a defence around diminished responsibility and extreme provocation. My client, Ms. Clark began, spent 30 years serving this community, cleaning its church, keeping its secrets, maintaining its sacred spaces. The discovery that Harold Pemberton had systematically violated the trust of grieving families, including her own sister, caused a psychological break. The prosecution, led by Mr. Whitmore, presented the facts methodically. The procurement of arsenic from the funeral home's old supplies, the deliberate contamination of the ceremonial gold, the careful timing to ensure maximum public impact. This was not a crime of passion, he argued, but a calculated attempt at murder, planned over several days with clear premeditation. Harold Pemberton was called to testify, looking diminished in a suit that now seemed too large for his frame. His voice shook as he described the poisoning, the burning sensation, the terror of being unable to breathe. "I thought I was dying," he said. The irony wasn't lost on me. A funeral director facing his own mortality in such a way. "Do you bear Mrs. Patterson any ill will?" his solicitor asked. Pemberton was quiet for a long moment. "How can I? I stole from her sister's corpse. If positions were reversed, I might have done the same." This admission caused a stir in the gallery. Miss Marple noticed several family members of Pemberton's victims nodding in agreement. Timothy Morrison's testimony proved particularly poignant. "Aunt Patricia was like a second mother to me after my parents died," he explained. "She never complained, never asked for anything. When I discovered the theft of my mother's brooch, she was more upset than I was. She kept saying, 'It's not right. It's just not right.'" "Did she ever express violent intentions?" Ms. Clark asked. "Never. She talked about justice, about truth coming to light, but I never imagined she meant this." The revelation that most surprised the court came from an unexpected source. George Hartley, the bank manager who had played Casper, asked to testify. "I need to clear my conscience," he began nervously. "I knew about Pemberton's gambling debts months ago. His accounts were overdrawn, loans defaulted. I should have reported it to the authorities. But he was a respected businessman, a pillar of the community. I gave him time to recover." "If you had acted then," the prosecutor pressed, "these thefts might have been prevented?" Hartley's face crumbled. "Yes, my inaction enabled his crimes." Miss Marple reflected on how many people bore some responsibility for the tragedy. The banker who looked the other way, the criminals who drove Pemberton to desperation, Pemberton himself for choosing theft over honest bankruptcy, and finally Mrs. Patterson for choosing poison over legal justice. The afternoon session brought character witnesses for Mrs. Patterson. Reverend Clement spoke of her decades of faithful service. Mrs. Price from the post office described her kindness to struggling families. Even some of Pemberton's victims testified on her behalf. "She did what we all wanted to do," said Mrs. Jennings, Alfred's daughter-in-law. "We just didn't have the courage." This statement caused the magistrate to call for order, warning against glorifying attempted murder. Sarah Morrison, Timothy's cousin, provided expert testimony about arsenic poisoning. "The dose Mrs. Patterson administered was carefully measured," she explained. "Enough to cause severe symptoms but unlikely to be fatal in a healthy adult. This suggests she intended to punish, not kill." "Objection," the prosecutor called. "The defendant is not a chemist. She couldn't have known the precise effects." "Actually," Sarah continued, "the journal she had access to, her grandmother's midwife records, contained detailed information about arsenic dosages and effects. She would have known exactly what she was doing." During a recess, Miss Marple encountered Mrs. Patterson in the courthouse corridor, accompanied by a police constable. "I suppose you think me foolish," Mrs. Patterson said quietly. "I think you're human," Miss Marple replied. "You faced an impossible situation and chose a dangerous solution. The question is whether you regret the act or just the consequences." Mrs. Patterson considered this. "I regret that Harold survived to suffer. Death would have been cleaner than living with his shame. Does that make me a monster?" "It makes you someone who has stared too long into the darkness," Miss Marple said gently. "Violence, even in pursuit of justice, corrupts the soul." The hearing concluded with the magistrate binding both defendants over for trial at the Crown Court. Mrs. Patterson was granted bail with strict conditions, while Harold Pemberton was released on his own recognizance. As the courthouse emptied, Miss Marple noticed Timothy Morrison and Alfred Jennings deep in conversation. They had formed an unlikely alliance, working to ensure all of Pemberton's victims received restitution. "Some good comes from every tragedy," Mrs. Bantry observed, following Miss Marple's gaze. "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied, "though I fear the cost of this particular revelation has been too high. 2 lives destroyed, a community's trust shattered, and all because one man couldn't face his debts honestly." The Epiphany parade had indeed brought revelation, but not the kind anyone had anticipated. The 3 kings' gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh had become symbols of greed, deception, and ultimately a bitter form of justice that satisfied no one. Chapter 10. Epiphany's final revelation. 6 months after the poisoning, St. Mary Mead gathered once again, this time for a very different ceremony. The village had decided to hold a service of reconciliation, an attempt to heal the wounds that the Epiphany tragedy had exposed. Miss Marple sat in her usual pew, observing how the community had changed in the aftermath of the revelations. Harold Pemberton had sold the funeral business to a national chain, using the proceeds to partially compensate his victims. He now lived in a small flat above the hardware store, working as a bookkeeper for local businesses. The man who had once commanded respect through his profession now earned it slowly through humble service and genuine remorse. Mrs. Patterson had been sentenced to 2 years in prison, suspended for 18 months, with 200 hours of community service. The judge had recognised the extraordinary circumstances while firmly condemning vigilante justice. She sat 3 rows behind Miss Marple, her community service vest marking her changed status. Timothy Morrison had transformed his veterinary practice into a community centre of sorts, offering grief counselling alongside animal care. His experience had given him unexpected insight into loss and betrayal, making him a compassionate listener for those struggling with their own traumas. "Dear friends," Reverend Clement began from the pulpit, "we gather today not to forget what happened, but to choose how we move forward." The events of Epiphany revealed painful truths about greed, betrayal, and revenge. But they also revealed truths about justice, community, and the possibility of redemption. Miss Marple noticed Alfred Jennings sitting with Harold Pemberton. The 2 men had formed an unlikely friendship through their shared experience of loss and betrayal. Jennings had recovered his wife's genuine ring, but had chosen to donate it to the Church Restoration Fund, saying Martha would have preferred it to serve the living, rather than rest with the dead. After the service, Miss Marple joined Mrs. Bantry in the church garden, where a small memorial had been erected, listing the names of those whose graves had been violated by Pemberton's thefts. Fresh flowers lay at its base, some placed by Pemberton himself in his ongoing act of penance. "Connor here from Velvet Clues again," Miss Marple imagined the narrator saying as she surveyed the scene. "What we've witnessed in St. Mary Mead reminds us that justice and revenge are not the same thing, though they often wear similar masks." Timothy Morrison approached them, accompanied by Sarah. "Miss Marple, I wanted to thank you. Your investigation ensured that the full truth came out, not just the convenient parts." "Truth has a way of emerging," Miss Marple replied, "though sometimes it needs a bit of assistance." Mrs. Patterson joined their small group, her hands dirty from planting flowers as part of her community service. "I've been thinking about what you said at the courthouse," she said to Miss Marple, "about staring too long into darkness. You were right. I became so focused on punishing Harold that I forgot about healing." "And now?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Now I plant flowers on graves, all graves, even those of people I don't like. It's a kind of prayer, I suppose, for them and for me." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, who had come to pay his respects. "The criminal syndicate that was pressuring Pemberton has been dismantled," he announced. "Your case led us to a major gambling ring. Some good came from all this, after all." As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple walked through the cemetery, pausing at Margaret Morrison's grave. The original Victorian cameo brooch had been returned, and now sat in a special display case in Timothy's clinic, a reminder of how small thefts could cascade into larger tragedies. The sound of children practicing for the next Epiphany parade drifted from the church hall. The tradition would continue, though with new safeguards and a deeper understanding of its symbolism. The 3 gifts would still be presented, but now they would represent not just the biblical offerings, but also the village's journey through deception, justice, and ultimately, forgiveness. Harold Pemberton stood alone by the memorial, reading each name slowly. Miss Marple approached him, noting how much he had aged in the past months. "I dream about them sometimes," he said quietly. "The people I robbed. They ask me why, and I never have an adequate answer." "Perhaps that's your penance," Miss Marple suggested, "to live with questions that have no satisfactory answers." "Mrs. Patterson tried to give me an answer with arsenic," he said with bitter humour. "I almost wish she had succeeded." "No," Miss Marple said firmly. Death would have ended your suffering but not repaired the damage. Living with consequence, making amends, that's the harder path but the more honourable one. As evening approached, the various participants in the tragedy went their separate ways. Mrs. Patterson to her empty cottage, Harold to his lonely flat, Timothy to his practice where he would continue trying to heal both animals and hearts. Miss Marple returned home, where she sat by her window and reflected on the case. The Three Kings' ransom had indeed been paid, not in gold, frankincense, or myrrh, but in trust betrayed and innocence lost. Yet from that payment had come something valuable, a community's recognition that justice must be pursued through law, not vengeance, and that even the gravest sins might find redemption through genuine repentance. Connor's voice seemed to echo in her mind as she closed her eyes. And so, dear listeners of Velvet Clues, our tale ends not with triumph but with truth, not with satisfaction but with understanding. The real mystery was never who poisoned Harold Pemberton, but why a community allowed desperation and greed to flourish in darkness until they exploded into violence. The Epiphany parade would come again next year, with new kings bearing symbolic gifts. But the greatest gift had already been given and received, the painful, precious gift of truth revealed. In the end, Miss Marple reflected, that was the only ransom worth paying.